So we're learning that there's a sharp and growing division between the North and South, and between those who support slavery and those who are against it. Life under slavery is brutal. You all know this, you've read about it, you've studied it. Slavery involved long days, very hard, backbreaking work. Slaves, of course, were at the whim of their masters and often suffered beatings, whippings, and humiliation. They were denied life's basic necessities, given very little in the way of food, clothing, and shelter. They were also denied education, access to the legal system. They had no rights as citizens. Also, often families, which were the core of slave life, families were often separated when members of the family were sold to other plantations. And there's a growing resistance to slavery. Nat Turner's rebellion is one of the more well-known rebellions. He led a slave revolt in Virginia, where he and about 25 recruits tried to take a weapons storage facility, but the effort failed and the participants were killed or captured and executed. And this really had negative consequences for slaves because it led many Southern slave owners to impose stricter rules on slaves, and these were called slave codes. It really caused Southern slave owners to come down on their slaves and be more cautious and wary. David Walker was actually a free African American, and he wrote this Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, and this was a pamphlet that used religion to attack slavery. It supported black rebellion and encouraged slaves to rise up against their owners. William Lloyd Garrison, we've talked a little bit about him. He was a white abolitionist who published his newspaper called The Liberator. And he tried to convince readers that slavery was morally wrong, that it was against human nature and our best interest to have slaves. He also had this very radical idea that slaves should be freed immediately with no compensation to slave owners. And this was, like I say, quite radical. Others had suggested that we free slaves, but of course maybe pay slave owners for their losses. Frederick Douglass, he's an escaped slave. He happened to be literate, and he became a very outspoken abolitionist leader. He also published the North Star, which was about abolition. And he served as an advisor to President Lincoln. This lovely pair of ladies, the Grimke sisters, were very well known, very liberal and outspoken couple of women. They worked both for the abolitionist movement and for women's rights. Sojourner Truth, of course, is a runaway slave. She is also a leading figure for both women's rights and abolition, and also serves as an advisor to President Lincoln. So she and the Grimke sisters both are kind of a nice transition to the women's movement, which was gaining momentum in the early 1800s. Of course, at that time, women faced many restrictions, many limits. They did not have the same rights as men. They could not vote. They could not own property. They were sometimes even limited in the way of education. Also, they were not supposed to speak in public. They were supposed to defer to their husbands or family members. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were some of the more well-known women's rights leaders. They helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention. Seneca Falls is a small town in upstate New York. It's right in the middle of the state of New York, and has very sort of humble foundings. But these women made it famous with their Seneca Falls Convention. At the Seneca Falls Convention, they formed this Declaration of Sentiments. It was kind of framed around the Declaration of Independence, only it was solely about women's rights, and it called for voting rights, among other things, and equal economic opportunities for women. The Declaration of Sentiments did not result in any changes in terms of legislation or government, but it really inspired many people to move forward with women's rights. So that's it for this presentation. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.